I had never trusted a woman who wanted to impress me. That was the plain truth of it, and I had learned it slowly, the way a man learns anything worth knowing, through repetition and disappointment. Through a long series of women brought before me in silk and good posture, each of them performing the version of themselves they imagined a king might want. My counsel was tireless in this project. They brought me daughters of alphas, daughters of merchants who had bought their way into rank, daughters of allied packs who arrived with letters of introduction and practiced smiles, and the particular kind of laughter that is designed to invite a man to believe he is funnier than he is. I was not funnier than I was, and none of them were what they were performing to be. My wolf understood this before I articulated it. He would pace behind me during those introductions, his great head low, his interest exactly as perfunctory as mine. He had never once gone still for any of them. He had never once lifted his nose and breathed a woman in, and then turned to look at me the way I had heard in stories that a wolf was supposed to look at his king when the mate was found. He simply endured the afternoons alongside me, and afterward we would ride out together across the moorland of Thornfeld, with the gold-brown grass parting around his legs, and the late light on the stone walls of the far pastures. And neither of us spoke, which is the only honest conversation two old friends can have about disappointment. I was 39 years old. I had been Alpha King of Thornfeld for 14 years, and I had not yet found my mate, and I had recently begun to wonder if I had been looking wrong. The thought arrived on a morning in early autumn when a wool merchant from the Eastern Ridge came to the hall to settle a trade dispute, and I watched him cross the courtyard with the particular ease of a man who had nothing to prove. He wore plain clothes. He carried no rank. He moved through my hall the way a stream moves through a field, finding the simplest path, unhurried, unperformed. When he sat before me, he answered my questions without ornament and left without ceremony, and I found that I had enjoyed the conversation more than any I had held in months. I wanted that ordinary, unhurried, unimpressed. That evening I made myself a private wager, not a bet with another man, not a challenge issued aloud where pride could harden it into something I could not walk back. A quiet bet between myself and the version of me that had not yet given up on the possibility of a real mate. If I went out into the world without the crown and the title and the counsel and the performance of rank, and if even one woman in the lowland markets of Thornfeld remained genuinely, simply, deeply unimpressed by me, not hostile, not cold, not performing indifference, but simply herself, as the wool merchant had been simply himself, then she was worth knowing. I told no one. I took my wolf, whose name was Sorrow, given to him as a pup by my grandmother, who had a dark sense of humor about the nature of kings, and I dressed in the plainest wool I owned, and rode down to the market in the valley below Thornfeld's golden walls. I did not expect to find anything. That was the honest version of the wager. I expected to spend a morning among the stalls, drink something warm, and ride back up the hill with the familiar gray weight of having confirmed what I already believed. She was at the third stall from the eastern gate. I nearly walked past her, which would have been the great comedy of my life, the Alpha King striding past his fated mate because he was busy being disappointed in the world. But Sorrow stopped. He simply stopped walking, the way a large animal does when it has made a decision that no amount of persuasion will reverse. I felt the lead go taut in my hand and turned. There was an injured wolf pup on the stall table. A young one, maybe 10 weeks, with a back leg bent wrong and a low, frightened sound in its throat. The woman was bent over it with both hands moving in slow, practiced circles, not pressing, just tracing, following the line of the injury with a steadiness that suggested she had done this many times, and had learned that steadiness itself was the first medicine. She was not performing anything. She had not looked up. "Hold still," she said, and for a moment I thought she was speaking to me, and something in my chest did a thing I had no name for. Then I understood she was speaking to the pup, and the pup, impossibly, held still. I stood watching for longer than I had intended. Sorrow sat down at her feet. He simply folded himself down, his great haunches lowering, and sat there the way he sat beside me when I read documents at my desk, with complete and settled intention. The woman scratched his ears without looking at him, the way you scratch the ears of a dog you know, and he leaned into it. She had never met my wolf. No one sat comfortably with Sorrow. He did not invite it. "Your wolf has a stone bruise on his left rear pad," she said, still not looking up. "He's been favoring it all morning. If you mean to ride him this afternoon, soak the foot in cold stream water for 20 minutes. I looked down at Sorrow. I had not noticed any favoring. I was the Alpha King of Thornfeld. This wolf had been my constant companion for 9 years, and a healer's assistant in the lowland market had observed something about him in 30 seconds that I had missed. "Thank you," I said. She said she was still focused on the pup. I stood there another moment, waiting for something, for her to look up to register me, to perform some version of courtesy at a man she didn't know. She did not. She was entirely occupied by the pup. I was simply the owner of the wolf who had sat down uninvited, and the owner of the wolf was a secondary matter. I bought a small jar of wound salve from her stall that I didn't need. She wrapped it without looking at my face and told me the price. I paid it. I said I hoped the pup would recover. She said it would if the owner stopped letting it climb things, which was a structural observation about the owner rather than a medical one, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. I walked away. Sorrow did not follow immediately. I felt the moment when he rose and came after me, and when I glanced back he had his head turned over his shoulder. When I looked, she was already focused on the next customer. She had not watched us go. I found I was thinking about that on the ride back up the moorland path. Not about her face, though I had looked at it, plain-featured in the way that takes time to understand, quick eyes that moved with purpose rather than performance, a steadiness in the hands that came from something deeper than training. I was thinking about the fact that she had not watched us go. Every woman in every introduction, when I left the room, turned slightly to track me with their eyes. It was not a conscious thing, most of the time. It was the behavior of someone who understood that a king's attention was the resource in the room, and leaving it required a small, private calculation. She had made no such calculation. Sorrow had sat at her feet, and she had scratched his ears with the ease of familiarity, and when we left, she had turned her attention to what was next. I soaked Sorrow's paw in the cold stream below the hall. He bore it without complaint and looked at me with amber eyes that said nothing and said everything. "I know," I said. I went back the next market morning. I told myself it was because I wanted to see how the pup had fared. This was not entirely untrue. It was, however, approximately 20% of the truth, and I had made a career of recognizing when men were lying to themselves, and I was doing it with a comfortable fluency. She was there, the pup was there too, in a small pen beside the stall eating, which was a good sign. She was sorting dried herbs into small linen bags and tying them with practiced, automatic fingers. "Pup looks better," I said. "Pup's owner listened," she said without looking up. "Then stone bruise." "Cleared up," I said, "as you said." "The cold water or a day off the trail?" "Both. I should confess it was partly an excuse to stand still for 20 minutes. She glanced up at that. Just briefly, a quick assessing look, the kind that takes the measure of a person rather than admiring them, then back to her herbs. "Most men don't admit when they need an excuse to slow down," she said. "I'm not most men," I said, and the moment it left my mouth I understood I had said it as a performance, a line, the kind of thing the Alpha King of Thornfeld might say to establish himself in a conversation. I felt the performance in my own voice, and it sat badly. She tied the next bag with clean efficiency, she said. Not impressed, not hostile. Simply observing, as she observed the pup and the wolf and the stone bruise, with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely looking, but had no stake in what she found. I bought 2 more herb packets I didn't need. I asked what they were for. She told me a drawing compound for inflammation, a steep for settling a wolf in pain. She answered because the questions were practical and she was a practical person, not because she was cultivating anything with me. Sorrow had arranged himself at her feet again. She stepped over him twice without comment to reach different parts of the stall, the way you step over a familiar dog, and he adjusted each time without complaint, and I found that I was watching this small domestic arrangement with something close to longing. When I left that morning, she was speaking with an old woman about a wolf with a persistent cough. She did not turn. On the 3rd market morning, I asked her name. "Marin," she said. "Calder," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those quick, assessing eyes, then nodded and went back to the compound she was mixing. No recognition. There was no Alpha King of Thornfeld in her accounting of the name Calder. It was simply a name, the way her name was simply a name, two people exchanging the basic information required for honest conversation. I cannot explain what it felt like to be nobody's king for a morning. I had been Alpha for so long that the title had grown into me the way a tree grows into a fence, the two things indistinguishable, the wood of the tree and the iron of the fence fused together at the point of contact. I had not, in 14 years, had a conversation with a stranger in which the stranger did not know who I was before I opened my mouth. Marin knew nothing about me, except that my wolf had a stone bruise, and I bought things from her stall that I demonstrably did not need. We talked that third morning for longer than the two prior ones. It was not a dramatic conversation. She asked about Sorrow's general health, not flirtatiously, as a strategy for talking to me through the wolf, but as a practitioner who had noted an animal she had seen 3 times and was making a record. I answered honestly. She suggested a change to his diet and wrote it on a small card in neat, economical handwriting. "You know wolf husbandry as well as healing," I said. "It's the same thing," she said. "A wolf who is well tends to a wolf who is sick. Most of what I do is prevent rather than cure." I thought about that for the rest of the day. That night I lay in the great bed of the king's chamber with the moorland dark outside and the candles burning low, and I understood that I had passed the 3 mornings of my wager and arrived at the honest conclusion. She had not tried to impress me once. She had been warm with my wolf and practical with me and entirely, simply herself. She was exactly what I had wagered I would not find. I had not expected to feel frightened. But I lay there in the dark with something pressing low behind my ribs, not pain, but a weight. A known thing, the way you recognize a place you've never been because it's in every story you were raised on. The mate bond did not announce itself. It did not blaze or sing or announce. It settled, like something that had been looking for its seat for a long time and had finally found the chair and sat down quietly. I pressed my hand flat against my chest. Sorrow, sleeping at the foot of the bed, raised his head and looked at me with ancient amber eyes. "Don't," I said. He put his head back down. On the 4th morning I told myself I was not going to the market. I was the Alpha King of Thornfeld. I had a document from the Eastern Ridge Pack requesting mediation in a water rights dispute, and 3 unanswered letters from my council about the autumn assembly, and a hall to run, and a pack depending on me. I was not going to the market to buy herb packets I didn't need in order to speak with a landless healer's assistant who had not once looked at me with anything resembling interest. I was at the market gate by the 2nd bell. Marin was rearranging the stall when I arrived. The pup was gone, returned to its owner. She told me when I asked, with instructions that it was not to climb anything for 30 days and the owner had looked at her like she'd asked him to halt the turning of the earth. She said this without particular heat, as a simple report. She had done her part. The rest was the owner's problem. Sorrow went to her. He went to her the way he went to his own bed at night, with the absolute certainty of an animal returning to a known place. He leaned against her leg. She put her hand on his head automatically. "He has decided to like you," I said. "He decided that the first morning," she said. She was right, he had. And she had accepted it without vanity, the way she accepted everything as a thing that was, not a thing that reflected on her. She cut a bruised root from a bundle she was sorting and set the good part aside and dropped the bruised piece into a bin below the table. Every motion economical, nothing wasted. "Marin," I said, "can I ask you something that isn't about wolf medicine?" She looked up, the quick eyes, the assessment. "You can ask," she said, which was not the same as agreeing to answer, and I found I respected the distinction entirely. "Why do you do this?" I said. "The healing, the market, you're good enough at it that you could be in a hall somewhere." She was quiet for a moment. She pulled the next bundle toward her and began sorting. "I'm not interested in being in a hall," she said. "Halls require performance. I'm not good at performance." The word landed in me like something thrown from a height. I looked at this woman in plain wool with her ink-stained fingers and her unhurried hands and her wolf medicine card in precise handwriting, and I thought, I am the Alpha King of Thornfeld, and I have been performing for 14 years, and I am so tired of it that I came to the market in disguise to find out if anything real still exists in the world. I did not say this. What I said was, "Neither am I." She glanced at me. the assessing look that was not admiring but was not unkind. "You seem like a man who's good at everything," she said. "I'm good at the appearance of it," I said, "which is a different thing." She considered this. She did not tell me it wasn't true, she did not reassure me. She thought about it the way she thought about a diagnosis, honestly, without predetermined outcome. "Yes," she said finally, "I think that's often true of men who are responsible for other people." I stood there looking at her, and the weight behind my ribs shifted and intensified, and became something I recognized from every story, and had never believed, and was now standing in the middle of at a market stall on a Tuesday morning while my wolf leaned against a healer's assistant's leg, with the absolute calm of an animal who had found where he was supposed to be. I was about to say something that I had not planned and did not know the shape of yet, something honest, something that would begin to close the distance between the performance I had been running and the thing that was actually happening inside me, when I heard my name. My real name, my full name, the Alpha King's name. "My Lord Calder." I turned. My senior counselor, Bran, was coming through the market gate on horseback, flanked by two of my guard, his face set in the particular expression of a man who has been sent to find his king, and is successfully hiding how long the search has taken. Behind him, pressing through the gate on foot, were the market regulars who had looked up at the horsemen and at the guard, and recognized the insignia on their cloaks, and were now looking at me. At the man in plain wool, who had been buying herb packets at Marin's stall for 4 mornings. I heard it move through the crowd the way a stone thrown into still water moves. First the closest ring, then the next, a murmur rippling outward. "The Alpha King." I did not look at Marin. I could not look at Marin. I kept my eyes on Bran, who had reined his horse 10 feet away and was watching me with the careful neutrality of a man who had worked for me long enough to understand that I would explain when I was ready and not a moment before. "My lord," Bran said, "the Eastern Ridge delegation arrived this morning. They had expected you by the first bell." "I'll be there by midday," I said. "Yes, my lord." In the crowd, someone had recognized the wolf as well, Sorrow, who was still, calmly and entirely, sitting at Marin's feet. I turned then, I had to, and I looked at Marin. She was looking at me. For the first time in 4 mornings, she was looking at me with something other than the quick assessing attention of a practitioner. She was still. Her hands had stilled over the herb bundles. Her expression was not afraid, not particularly surprised, more the expression of a person who has just found the right term for something that had been slightly misnamed. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Calder." Not my lord, not Alpha King. Just the name I had given her, stripped of what she had not known it carried. "Marin," I said. "And then it happened." I do not have a story that makes it dignified. I do not have a speech I was in the middle of or a significant gesture I was making. I was simply standing in the market, looking at her, and the mate mark blazed. Mine first, on the inside of my right wrist, beneath the cuff of the plain wool, a heat I had heard described and had half believed, and was now feeling with absolute, unambiguous certainty. Gold. The shape of it familiar from the seals and histories and the stories told over fires, the spiral branch of the mate mark, the thing that did not lie and could not be manufactured, and did not arrive for any reason except the single real one. And then, a heartbeat later, I heard her sharp intake of breath. I looked up. She had her left hand turned palm up, cradled against her chest, and on the inside of her wrist the same gold light burned. The spiral, the branch, hers and mine in open market in front of my council and my guard and every person who had pressed through the gate to look at the Alpha King standing at a healer's stall. She stared at it, she looked at me. Around us, I was aware of the silence, the particular silence of a crowd that has just witnessed something it has only heard about in stories, and is now recalibrating its understanding of what is possible. Several of the pack women near the gate had gone completely still. I had been aware of them in the prior mornings as a background presence, the women of rank who came to the market more for the social structure of it than the commerce, who moved in clusters and managed information about who was of consequence and who was not. They had walked past Marin's stall many times without stopping. She was landless. She had no rank. She was the healer's assistant in plain wool who sold herb packets and wolf medicine. I saw one of them, a woman in fine cloth, the mate of an elder from the northern ridge, put her hand to her mouth. "Marin," I said her name because it was the only honest thing I knew how to say. The language of kings, the formal claim, the public declaration, the titles, and the ceremony was still available to me and would have been entirely accurate, and none of it was what I wanted. She looked at me with those quick eyes that did not perform and did not flatter and did not manage. "You should have told me your name," she said. "I know. The whole name. I know." She looked at the mark on her wrist. She did not seem frightened of it. She seemed to be doing what she did with the injured pup and the stone bruise and the herb bundles, observing it carefully, making a true accounting. "Is this," she started. "Yes," I said. "And there's nothing to—" "I would not ask you to accept it," I said. "I will not compel anything, the mark is there. What you do about it is yours." She looked at me for a long time. "You came to the market in plain wool," she said. "Yes." "4 mornings." "Yes." "And you were testing something?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Myself," I said, "mostly." Something moved in her expression, not softness exactly, not warmth in the performed sense, but recognition. The same recognition she'd had when she identified Sorrow's stone bruise, something seen clearly and named correctly. "That's honest," she said. "You deserve honest," I said, "if nothing else." Bran had not moved. The guard had not moved. The crowd had not moved. The world was waiting, the way the world waits at moments that will be told in stories later, and I found I did not want to perform any of it. I did not want the formal declaration, or the ringing speech, or the public ceremony of the claiming that my counsel would have preferred. I said, "Maren, I have spent 4 mornings watching you not try to impress anyone, and it is the most remarkable thing I have seen in 14 years of being impressed by very little. My wolf has been sitting at your feet since the first morning. My own heart got there faster than my pride. I would like to know you as yourself, and as mine if you'll have me, and I will stop performing and simply be a man trying to be worth the trust of the one woman I have ever met who didn't try to shape herself around what she thought I wanted." The crowd was very quiet. Maren looked at the mark on her wrist. She looked at Sorrow, who had not moved from her side, who was sitting with the settled certainty of a wolf who understood exactly where he was. Then she looked at me. "That was still a somewhat formal speech," she said. "It was the shortest version I had," I said. "Can you be brief?" "With practice," I said. "I've had very little practice." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll help you practice." The woman near the gate had lowered her hand from her mouth. The cluster of pack women was very still, very straight, wearing the expressions of people in the presence of something they had underestimated. The elder's mate in fine cloth had a look I could not name, not shame exactly, but the near neighbor of it. Maren had not looked at them. She was looking at me. "All right, Calder," she said. "Alpha King of Thornfeld." "All right," I said. What followed was not simple. Nothing real ever is. My counsel had questions. Bran, who was a good man and had watched me conduct the affairs of Thornfeld for 14 years with the steady competence of a king who had been waiting for something without knowing what, asked them with careful neutrality, and I answered them with the honesty the situation required. No, I did not know her family. Yes, I was certain of the mark. No, I had not taken leave of my senses, though I understood the question was reasonable given the circumstances of my discovery. She was a healer's assistant from the lowland market. She was landless. She had no pack rank. She had not sought the title, had not sought me, had not performed a single hour of the long campaign that most women in her position would have understood was required to win the attention of the Alpha King of Thornfeld. She had sold me herb packets and told me to soak my wolf's paw in cold water. The Eastern Ridge delegation waited until the following morning for my mediation, which I offered my full attention and resolved without excessive difficulty, and afterward I returned to the market. She was there. She was always there unless it was a non-market day, and I learned her schedule the way I had learned Sorrow's preferences and the tides of the moorland seasons, as facts about a world I was orienting myself inside. I asked if I could sit with her while she worked. She said yes if I was useful. I asked what useful looked like. She handed me a bundle of dried stems and told me to strip the leaves into a bowl, and she would tell me if I was doing it wrong. I stripped stems for 2 hours. I did it wrong twice, and she corrected me without ceremony. She told me what the herbs were for, and I listened the way I had once listened to the great teachers of pack law in my youth, with the genuine attention of someone who understands that they are learning something real. Sorrow slept between us. Occasionally one of us would put a hand on him. This was, I understood, as close to what I had actually wanted as I had ever gotten. The mark on my wrist was still gold warm. Hers, she told me, had quieted to a low warmth, not the blaze of the first moment, but a constant, settled heat she had been monitoring with the same clinical interest she brought to everything. "Does it bother you?" I asked. "No," she said, with the directness that I had understood by then was simply how she spoke. "It's very clear about what it is. I appreciate clarity." "It is clear," I agreed. "Were you afraid?" she asked. Not of the mark of me, of the power, of the whole situation she had been folded into without warning. She was asking whether I had been afraid of the mark. "Terrified," I said. She nodded as if this was a sensible answer. So was I, but I've found that fear of a clear true thing is different from fear of an unclear thing. The first kind you can work with. I thought about that for a long while. I had been afraid for 14 years of the unclear thing, the performance, the unsatisfying introductions, the long gray procession of women who were not themselves, and a king who was not sure he was himself either. That fear had no edge to take hold of. It was fog. This fear had a shape. It was the shape of Marin, sorting herb bundles in plain wool, telling me I had been doing the leaves wrong. I could work with this. The formal claiming was 3 weeks later. My council had wanted ceremony. They had wanted the great hall, the full pack assembly, the titles and the declaration, and the pomp that announced to the allied packs of the territory that the Alpha King had found his Luna. I understood the need for it. A pack is held together partly by the meaning it places in its rituals, and a king who ignores those rituals entirely is a king who is asking his pack to navigate by feeling alone, which is a large ask. But I negotiated the ceremony down to something Marin could bear. She had told me when I raised the subject that she would do what was required and asked me to tell her exactly what that was so she could prepare. She did not perform anxiety. She gathered information. She asked questions about the order of service, the expected gestures, what she would need to wear, whether she was supposed to speak or only be spoken over. "You can speak," I said, "if you want." "What would I say?" "Whatever you mean," I said. She thought about it. "Then I'll say something short." "Good," I said. "I'll try to match you." She looked at me. "You said you'd practice being brief." "I'm practicing," I said. The hall was full. Every pack elder from the territory, every allied family, the whole assembly of Thornfeld's people, and in the front, in the reserved seats at the left of the hall, the pack women from the market. The elders made in fine cloth. The cluster of women who had walked past Marin's stall for years, who had accounted her as nothing, whose understanding of worth was built on rank and name and the performance of significance. I watched Marin walk into the hall. She wore a dress that her neighbor had helped her with, something plain by hall standards but carefully made, a deep heather gray that suited her and that she had chosen herself without input from my counsel, who had offered opinions at length and been politely declined. Her hair was up in the way she kept it when she was working. Her hands were still ink-stained at the knuckles because she had been making notes until the morning of the ceremony. She did not look at the crowd, she looked at me. I crossed the hall to her, which was not the protocol. The protocol had her walking the length of the hall alone to stand before the king. I found I didn't want her to do that. I had asked her to stand in front of a hall full of people who had not known she existed until 3 weeks ago, and it seemed to me that the least I could do was go to her rather than make her come to me. Brand's eyebrows rose. He made no comment. I walked to her and took her left hand, the hand with the mark, and turned it so the gold spiral faced the hall. "This is Marin," I said to my assembled pack. "She is my fated mate. She is the Alpha King's Luna. She is also the best healer in the lowland market, and she will tell you your wolf medicine is wrong if it is, so I recommend consulting her honestly rather than presenting the version of the situation you think she wants to hear." From the body of the hall, someone laughed, genuine, startled, then more. Marin beside me was looking at the hall now, not performing, just looking as she looked at everything honestly with the quick eyes that took the full measure. "I'm Marin," she said into the quiet that followed the laughter. "I don't have a prepared speech. I want to be honest with you the way I try to be honest with anyone. I didn't know who he was when I met him. I knew his wolf first, and I knew he was a man who bought herbs he didn't need because he wanted an excuse to have a real conversation." She paused. "I respected that more than I would have respected the crown. I still do. I hope that's useful information for a pack who'll want to know what kind of Luna I intend to be." The hall was quiet in the way it is quiet when people are paying attention, rather than waiting for their turn to respond. Bran was looking at her with an expression I had seen on his face exactly twice in 14 years. Once when I resolved the most complicated territorial dispute of my reign with what he later called inappropriate simplicity, and once when my grandmother died and he had delivered the news and I had, contrary to his expectations, not needed him to stay. The expression was respect. I placed my other hand over both of hers. The mate mark on my wrist and the mate mark on hers were side by side, gold and settled, the warmth of them steady as a hearth fire. "Luna of Thornfeld," I said, formally, for the record and the hall and the allies and the pack women in the front seats and Bran's formal notation and all the history this moment would become. And then, because I was practicing brevity, "Marant." She looked up at me. "Yes," she said, plainly, without ornament. The way she said everything because she meant it and nothing about her required ornament for meaning to land. The pack made the sound of a pack that has witnessed something it believes in. Not the performed reverence of a formal ceremony, but the real thing, the sound of people who have just decided to follow someone. Sorrow, who had been lying along the wall of the great hall with his head on his paws, and the patience of an animal who had known for 4 mornings how this would end, raised his head. His amber eyes moved from Marin to me and back. His tail swept the stones once. Once. Then he put his head back down. He had made his observation and did not need to perform it further. The months that followed remade me in ways I had not anticipated and would not have been able to describe in advance. It was not dramatic. The remaking of a man by a woman who is entirely herself is not a dramatic process. It does not arrive with blaze and announcement. It arrives in the way things she had told me arrived. Steadily, practically, in the form of specific and accurate observations that required only the willingness to receive them honestly. She moved into the hall with 2 bags and a box of herb supplies, and she made space on the healer's shelf in the council room and declined the offer of a separate study because she said she preferred to work where people were. She established herself in the corner of the council chamber with her notes and her bottles and her calm, and within a month every member of my council was consulting her about something, not because I had suggested it, but because she was there and she was useful, and she did not hedge her observations with the protective qualifications that advisors develop over years of managing a king's feelings. She told me when I was wrong, not loudly, not as a challenge, the way she had told me I was stripping the herb leaves incorrectly, with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who considered accuracy a basic courtesy. I found I had been very wrong about several things. The water rights dispute with the Eastern Ridge, once I applied what Marin had said to me about practical versus ceremonial solutions, resolved in a way both packs could work with. The harvest tax structure that had gone unchanged for 2 reigns turned out, on examination, to have a structural problem that everyone had known about, and no one had raised because no one wanted to be the one to raise it. And Marin asked about it at a council meeting with the guileless directness of someone who had not yet learned which questions were too inconvenient to ask, and it was resolved in the following season. I do not want to imply she was a reformer. She was not attempting to reform anything. She was simply herself, which, in the context of a court that had long since learned to present rather than speak, had the effect of a window opened in a room that had been closed for too long. I watched her in those months, the way I had first watched her in the market, with the attention of someone who is genuinely looking and not performing the attention. I watched her heal a wolf with an injury the hall healer had been treating incorrectly for 3 months, calmly, without making the hall healer feel diminished, which was a skill I had never developed. I watched her learn the names of every person in the hall within the first week because she had asked, and then retained, because she considered it basic courtesy to know the name of the person you were speaking to. I watched her learn the names of every wolf, too, and their specific natures. Which ones were anxious, which ones were steady, which ones had injuries that had healed imperfectly and needed monitoring. She was better with the wolves than I was, and I had been among them all my life. How, I asked her once genuinely. I listened to them, she said, not for what I want to hear, for what's there. I thought about the 14 years of introductions, the women brought before me, all the things I had wanted to hear and hadn't, and the things that had actually been there that I had not been listening for. That's useful advice, I said. It's just advice, she said. You have to want to use it. I want to use it. I know, she said. You've been practicing. She said this without irony. She meant it. She had noticed, because she noticed everything, that I had been making the specific effort to receive information rather than to manage it. She was reporting the observation the way she reported all observations, accurately, without embellishment, without the particular warmth that would have turned it into a reassurance, and therefore made it less honest. I had been practicing, she had noticed. That was worth more to me than any ceremony. On the night of the first autumn assembly after our bonding, I stood at the window of the king's chamber with the moorland dark outside, and the candles burning in the same places they had burned on the night I lay in this bed, and understood I had found what the wager had been about. The difference was that Marin was behind me, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her notes from the day's assembly spread around her, making corrections in her precise handwriting to something the supply steward had reported. The ink smell and the quiet scratch of the pen and Sorrow asleep at the foot of the bed, his great chest rising and falling. You're looking at the moor, she said without looking up. I often do, I said. You do it when you're thinking about something you haven't worked out yet. I turned, she had glanced up, the quick eyes. How long have you known that? I asked. Since the second market morning, she said. The second morning. She had been cataloging me since the second morning, without performance, without agenda, simply watching the way she watched everything, with the honest attention of someone who considers the world worth observing. I crossed the room, I sat on the edge of the bed. Sorrow thumped his tail once without waking. What was I thinking about the second morning? I asked. She put down her pen. She looked at me with the full attention she gave to things she was being honest about. You were thinking that you'd come back for real reasons, she said. And you weren't ready to say so. I looked at her, this woman who had been entirely herself since the first morning, who had scratched my wolf's ears without looking up, who had told me my herb leaves were wrong, and my instinct about the water rights was partially mistaken, and my formal speech was longer than necessary, who had walked into my hall in a heather-gray dress she'd chosen herself, and told my assembled pack that she respected a man who needed an excuse for a real conversation, who had never once tried to impress me. I took her hand. The mate mark was warm and steady on both our wrists, hers and mine, the same gold, the same spiral branch, settled now the way a fire settles when it has been burning long enough to stop announcing itself. I came back for real reasons, I said. I know, she said. I should have told you the whole name on the second morning. You should have, she agreed, not unkindly, simply accurately. I'll practice brevity, I said. You've improved, she said. Sorrow made the sound a wolf makes when he is deeply asleep and content, a long, slow exhale that was almost a sigh and contained within it every morning in the market, the stone brews, the herb packets, the 4 days of plain wool, and the one moment when the gold blazed in open air. He had known. He had folded himself down at her feet on the first morning with the absolute certainty of an animal who does not need to perform what it knows. I had taken 4 mornings, and the whole of my pride to arrive at the same place. Marin, I said. Calder, she said. Just the name. Nothing before and nothing after, the way she said things when she meant them completely and decoration would have cost something. The moorland was dark beyond the window and the candles were low, and the great wolf slept between us, and the mate mark was warm on both our wrists. And for the first time in 14 years of being the Alpha King of Thornfeld, I did not feel the need to do anything other than exactly this. I had wagered that something real still existed in the world. I had been right, and she had been right that I was coming back for real reasons before I had admitted it to myself, and she had been right about Sorrow's paw and the herb leaves and the water rights dispute and the supply steward's figures. She was generally right. I was learning to find this useful rather than disorienting. That perhaps was the most significant reform of my reign.